Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar for May 2018, presented as a partnership between Build Consulting and Community IT Innovators. In this webinar, Build Consulting's panel of experts will be answering your questions submitted regarding nonprofit development operations and technology. We received a number of excellent questions from the audience in advance, which we boiled down into 6 that we'll plan on answering during this session. And if we have extra time, we'll take additional live questions from the audience towards the end. This is an informal, collaborative discussion. If you would like a more comprehensive answer to a particular question or something that speaks more directly to your individual situation, please do contact us and we'll be happy to have a conversation with you. And information about how to reach us will be shared at the conclusion of this webinar. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and the video and slides will be made available to all registrants within the next day or so. My name is Peter Miras, and I'm a partner at Build Consulting, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I've spent the last 20 years helping nonprofit organizations develop and implement their communications, development, and technology strategies. Before we get started, please remember to ask questions via chat if you have any. Feel free to connect with us on Twitter. Avoid multitasking. You may just miss the best part of the presentation. And finally, as I mentioned, the links and recording slides will be shared after the webinar. Before we get started into the Q&A, just a few little bits about Community IT and Build Consulting. We're both invested in working exclusively with nonprofit organizations. We have a strategic orientation towards helping our clients make informed decisions, and we collaborate with our clients to make sure that they can feel empowered and own the choices that they're making in regards to their technology. Build Consulting provides 3 different kinds of services. The first is outsourced or interim CIO services. We perform projects in which we do a wide range of strategic assessments or technology roadmaps, as well as system selections and implementations. And with Build Teams, we provide outsourced data managers to nonprofits. With deep development operations and nonprofit CRM expertise. Joining me today are Peter Gross, Joe Butler, and Kyle Haynes, all from Build Consulting. Peter, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Gross. I'm one of the partners at Build Consulting. Similar to Peter, I've been in the nonprofit and technology business since the early 90s. Have been working with this great team at Build in various capacities for many, many years. So really happy to be here and appreciate everyone's questions.
Joe?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Butler, and I've been the Build Team CRM manager for about 1.5 years. But before Build, I worked my whole career on the other side, some of your side, working for nonprofit organizations focused on conservation, healthcare, and international development. So I have a real fondness for working with fundraising and development ops teams, and I like to think that I have a good understanding of all the intricacies that those systems and processes have. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today, and thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Joe. Kyle?
Good afternoon. I'm Kyle Haynes. I'm also a partner at Build Consulting, and like Joe, I spent some time working in nonprofits. My start was in the fundraising department in a nonprofit in the Pacific Northwest. And so while I enjoy lots of different topics related to nonprofit technology, today's conversation is one of particular interest. And I'm looking forward to getting to spend some time with my colleagues and actually hearing some of their ideas and some of their thoughts on some of the questions that we got today.
Thanks, Kyle. Without further ado, let's move on to the first question from our audience. Again, these questions were submitted in advance. We have 6 of them, and it is, what have been the major fundraising or development technology trends and evolutions over the past 3 to 4 years? So for those who are head down in their own particular solution or might not have been in the business of selecting a new solution for their organization recently, what's changed? What's been happening? And Kyle, I'd like to go to you first on this one.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, for me, it's funny because when I started in fundraising, we were actually using a DOS-based program. And so, needless to say, there have been evolutions over the last 20 years, but I think the pace of change in the last 3 to 4 years has been somewhat remarkable. And I think probably the biggest change is everybody's aware of this idea of software as a service, where you have software that's hosted in the cloud. But what's one of the bigger changes that I'm seeing is this idea of platform as a service, where organizations are looking at CRM platforms and approaching it as an enterprise-wide CRM exercise. And two examples would be Salesforce and Microsoft Dynamics 365. Both of those, we've actually blogged about it. I think Peter Miras, you've written a blog piece, and so have you, Peter Gross. This has in some ways been a seismic change for some organizations, and some have been successful and some haven't. And I think some of the questions we got speak to this. But what this has meant for organizations is that they have to be more attendant to the change implications of CRM projects in a way that before the last 3 to 4 years, they perhaps didn't, as those systems primarily impacted single departments. The second one that I can think of is that there's been an increased emphasis on linking engagement and CRM. So when I started, those were two disparate systems. And I think more and more people are interested in a set of systems that give organizations better visibility into how they manage constituent relations and how they engage with those constituents. And this has just meant that there is a large quantity of data coming oftentimes from multiple systems.
Yeah, I've been really impressed about how many smaller sort of software companies have created really robust solutions for specific fundraising needs. And so it takes the pressure off nonprofits to find that sort of single CRM solution that does everything sort of well. Say for example, like a cause marketing or peer-to-peer plugin or platform. And there's also a number of integration tools that help those systems talk to each other. So managing those multiple plugins a little less daunting and cumbersome.
Yeah, this is Peter Gross. I would build on something Kyle said. I really like the phrase seismic change associated with platforms as a service. I also started out in fundraising a long time ago. And back in those days, people had pretty much single point solutions. They had a fundraising solution, and they had a financial solution, and maybe there was another solution, but they were, for the most part, things that were built by vendors, and you sort of knew who to go to from the perspective of getting support for that particular solution. You might not have always have liked the answer, but I think part of the seismic shift of people moving to platforms and Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, is really that it has caused us and our clients to have to rethink what support looks like for that, for a couple of reasons. One is that Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics really have a different support structure. They don't have the same kind of intimate knowledge of the specific functionality that nonprofits are often deploying. And the other reason is that often cases, and we've seen this probably more in Salesforce than in Microsoft Dynamics recently, is every one of the installations, implementations of Salesforce has a different set of apps. Those apps are often differently customized. And so being really careful about what, not only can you get it built, but how do you support it over time, it's really forced us to think differently about what that looks like.
That's a great point, Peter. And in addition to what has been said by Kyle and Joe and Peter so far, I'm thinking about one of my clients right now who was doing a selection for a CRM, and once they started getting a little bit more into the weeds about what a CRM platform was and how they might be interacting with something like Salesforce, they realized that they needed to also plan for what other systems that they were going to be using over the next three years, say. They had to select what the ERP of the future would be. They had to select their HRIS system of the future, their human resources information system. So what I'm seeing increasingly is full sort of cross-organizational selections happening at once, even if the implementation is going to be phased. Kyle, are you seeing anything similar to that?
I think that's an interesting. I hadn't really thought of that before. The client that I have been at most recently, that's actually precisely what happened. The move to Salesforce sort of spurred them to take a look at their financial system, and they ended up moving to a cloud-based system primarily for the benefit of being able to better integrate with Salesforce. And obviously I was aware of those two things, but I don't think I had ever specifically tried to link together those two things, but I think that's an interesting idea.
I'm going to go ahead and mix in a question from the audience here since we've mentioned Salesforce. And the question is, it seems that Salesforce has dominated the market. Do you think Microsoft or any other company has a chance to be competitive? Peter G., would you like to take a stab at that one?
Sure. So I think yes, absolutely other companies have a chance to be competitive. I think, certainly Blackbaud and some of the more traditional fundraising solution companies, as well as online communication companies, I think there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the marketplace. So I think we're not in danger of Salesforce sort of dominating the market. And I think we've started to hear rumblings that Microsoft Dynamics may be moving more in a nonprofit oriented direction as well. I'd say we really don't know what that looks like or when it's coming about. But in some ways, I would say the Salesforce entrance into the market has provided competition for what has always been the sort of elephant in the room, which is Blackbaud. And I think it's been to both companies' benefit that they're both there, because it's spurring innovation. It's spurring a desire probably to beat each other, and thus to roll out more and more functionality, better support, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have any concerns about the marketplace being dominated, because there's a lot more interesting choices than there used to be, at least from my perspective.
I think that's a great answer, and we certainly are seeing and interact with different vendors, pretty much every month, such as Every Action and Roy Solutions and a number of others. One that was just mentioned in chat is Civa CRM. We position them, or I at least usually see them more used by small to mid-sized community and activist organizations. That's not necessarily where they are exclusively, but that seems to be the sweet spot for Civa CRM implementers. Let's go ahead and move to the next question. We can always cycle back to this later if there's more questions about it. And that is, what should nonprofit fundraising and development look for in the future evolution of CRM technology? What are the kinds of improvements or enhancements that we should expect to see maybe over the next year or two, or even longer than that? Joe, let's go to you first on this one.
Okay, sure. Let's see. I think there's definitely a rise in user-friendly analytic tools. So nonprofits now have more control over analyzing their data and making thoughtful business considerations based upon these improvements in AI. So by using a constituent's behavior, predictive analytics can help implement sort of smarter marketing campaigns, help identify prospects, for example. But ultimately, they're just tools, right? I would never recommend eliminating the human element to those processes. It's only when you sort of combine the technology and the human element, when they're in balance, that you can really see the data deliver the results you need, you want.
Yeah, that's right. So this is Peter G. again. I think that's exactly right what Joe said, and I would even take it a step farther. Again, hearkening back to the good old days of my beginnings in this industry, it used to be that we had a whole lot of data, we could report on that data, and that we sent all the data off if we were in if we were doing heavy direct marketing, off to a firm that could crunch the numbers and do the analytics and all that kind of stuff. And I think what we're seeing now, to Joe's point, is that a lot more people have access to a lot more analytics and a lot more insight. And I think if I was, and I am, advising nonprofits on some of these developments, we now are in a position where we have to start to get people caught up to how do we actually take all of this analytical information, all of these insights that are being provided to us by whether it's Salesforce or Razor's Edge NXT or any of these other pieces that are sort of hand delivering intelligence to us. How do we analyze it? How do we understand it? And how do we incorporate it into a strategy that we can actually be able to take advantage of it? The phrase that's been running through my head the last 6 or 9 months has been data literacy, because I think people just have a hard time. More and more data doesn't necessarily make our jobs more and more easy, or doesn't make it easier. I think the better we get at insisting that all of us become more literate at managing and understanding data and being able to take those great insights and turn them into action. To me, that's the next frontier of all this. I think we already have so much technology that we still have to catch up to. And if we do, we're going to be able to take much better advantage of it and turn it into really actionable insights.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that I think that the question you asked, Peter, was about, sort of technology was at the core of the question. And I really like what Peter Gross said about data literacy, because technology really can't make us more data literate. And I think, to build on what Joe and Peter said, is I think building in greater internal data capabilities and staffing around those capabilities is going to be one of the things that organizations are going to have to be forward-looking on. And I think building on what you said, Peter, this idea of drawing a distinction in data between what's interesting and what's actionable. And oftentimes I see organizations spend lots of time looking at data that may be interesting, but it actually doesn't roll up anything actionable. And I think that's a piece of data literacy. How do we get organizations and their leaders to be craving information that's actionable, not just interesting?
That's a great point, Kyle. In regards to all of what you panelists have said in your responses, I remember reading a survey a couple of years ago from nonprofit organizations in the UK, and one of the things that it found was that I think it was over 60% of organizations collected sort of M&E or monitoring and evaluation data about their programs and their operations effectiveness, but only 5% actually used that data that they collected to improve operational practices. So there's definitely a lag between not just the data collection and the ability to visualize and analyze the data, and the desire and organizational alignment to leverage that capacity for improving outcomes. There's been a huge stressor placed by funders on the nonprofit community to show data and use that data to improve their outcomes, but the reality isn't catching up quite to that as much as I had thought and hoped it would, 4 or 5 years ago. One of our audience members asks, do you think there are more advancements that can be made with data visualization, or have those peaks been reached? I think that there is more advancement that can be made in data visualization, and I'll just throw out an example there. One of the things that I was privileged to see a couple years ago was a demo of a product that was three-dimensional rendering of data visualizations within a virtual environment. So I put on a pair of goggles, and all of a sudden I saw data objects representing the data, field data, and was floating in front of me in the air, and I was told that within a couple years, I would be able to put on a pair of gloves and interact with it Iron Man style. So that's something that's going to come first to government contractors and things of that nature. That's not technology that's immediately going to be moving into the nonprofit space. But there's a lot of interest around how VR can be used to, along with data visualization and also storytelling, to help influence funders and demonstrate new realities, as it were. So that's interesting. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so if I can add on to what you just said, Peter, but take it in the 100% opposite direction. Just a quick reference for folks to look up, because I think that in this topic of data literacy, I think would find it interesting. So there's a book out by Charles Duhigg. He wrote one book on the power of habits, and he wrote another book called Smarter, Faster, Better. I think that's what it's called. It's a terrible title, but it's a great book. And he talks about a group of teachers in an education system, public school system, and I think it was Ohio. And they had this great new computer system. It had all this data about students and outcomes and initiatives and, you know, all of these things. And they found that teachers just weren't using it or weren't getting the kind of insights out of it. And what they ended up doing was actually taking a bunch of that data and putting it on index cards, putting it in the middle of the table, and having groups of teachers interact with the data and organize it as a way to actually understand and make insights out of the data, which they did at a much higher rate than they did when it was in the computer. So I'm not arguing for everyone to go back to index cards, but rather as a way to say this leap into understanding how to make sense out of data is more than just a computer issue. It's actually it's a mindset issue. And there's a lot of interesting ways to get people more comfortable and more literate with managing data.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost in some ways, you're talking about a virtual reality experience, Peter Gross, in that exercise. Even though it's not virtual, people are actually physically touching and interacting with the data itself. So, I mean, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of technology that's been developed that isn't in nonprofits' hands right now because it's not sort of available on the mass market. But I just to cycle back to one of the points that was made earlier, I do think that in general, the technology is already beyond the average organization's ability to take advantage of it, whether it's that question about data literacy or internal data analysis capacity or whatever that might be. So there's definitely more immediate work to be done in the short term around developing staff capacity and for taking advantage of, say, Tableau, for example, than there is for actual advancements in the technology, as far as the vast majority of contemporary nonprofits are concerned.
You know, interestingly, Joe and I were in a meeting earlier today, and we are using data visualization, even in just a rudimentary way, to approach data cleanup and to help the organization understand, with something as granular as constituent codes, for those of you who are on the webinar who work with Blackbaud products or work with the Razor's Edge, you know, we were exploring how do we use a tool like Power BI, how do we use that in
I think we lost Kyle. Kyle,
what the impact of their
second on audio
database
Can you repeat that?
Oh man, it was so good.
So
go
ahead.
I was just saying, Joe and I were in a meeting earlier today, and sorry for the bad audio quality. I'm not quite sure why that is. And we were using data visualization to approach something even fairly prosaic like constituent codes, and talking about how we could allow our client to interact with that data to understand how a single field and the way they used it impacted their ability to analyze data. So I really like the theme of interactivity that's come up in what Joe said and what Peter Gross said and what you also said, Peter Maris.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to really get buy-in for data quality internally is to visualize the data. Because for some reason, when you're just throwing numbers around, it doesn't have the same impact as showing a pie chart that shows the huge 40% segment of constituents for which don't currently have a code or don't currently have a state on their address or whatever the case might be. Well, let's keep it moving and go on to the next question. And that is, I'm starting an individual giving program from the ground up. What should be my major focus points? I'd like to start off with Kyle. Kyle, you have a lot of experience in this area.
I do. I have a lot of experience, I think, and a lot of interest, especially when I get to think about individuals, because there's a lot of behavior associated with individuals, and it's oftentimes easier for us to understand individual behavior versus organizational behavior. And when I think about doing anything that relates to people and relates to individuals, I really want to understand what I want their journey to be through an organization. And I think of a constituent journey a lot like a flow chart, and it just shows the steps of a constituent's interactions with you and any decisions that they might make or you might make along the way. And I think I would want to start with any organization, getting agreement around what that journey should be, because from there I can then begin to build what are the processes and the data and the people that we need to support that journey in a way that's high quality. I guess one thing I would just add is oftentimes the work we have to do is make sure that journey is actually aligned with best practices. And for example, if your constituent journey, we all know that acknowledgement letters should go out quickly. If your journey makes it impossible to acknowledge donors quickly, you probably need to look at the journey and understand its processes again. So starting with this idea of visualizing the journey, I think oftentimes helps the entire organization understand its role in something like an individual giving program before I dive into what are specific processes, what are the data, what's the data I need to collect, and those sorts of decisions.
So you're saying that that visualization and that process needs to anticipate even the selection of the technology.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think in some ways, because this is such a high stakes group for so many nonprofits, it's an easy way for the entire organization to understand the role they play in that journey, especially because these are the folks often for many organizations that sustain the organization financially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could add something just to the constituent journey, something that I've been reading up on lately and have been observing is, the constituent's offline experience versus their online experience. And so I would probably recommend sort of an integrated online offline giving strategy. I think it's important that you're keeping up with newer giving mechanisms in conjunction with the traditional snail mail solicitations. But I think that integrating fundraising sort of requires assimilation across the entire nonprofit and a commitment to become more constituent centric. So, sort of commit to better focus on your programs, your departments and channels, just by making small tweaks like shared themes, images, the offers in the mail and email, keeping your website dynamic, encouraging offline donors online. And so their constituent experience isn't sort of a different one depending on which avenue they wish to donate. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Peter G., would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add on, I think, to what Kyle was talking about with the journey piece, because one of the things I've always found interesting, and I've watched Kyle do this kind of exercise is, in that journey, it's interesting to think about. So if you're thinking about an individual giving program, any organization could probably identify 8 to 10 to 12, even more ways that actual or potential donors end up making their way onto their radar screen, whether that's a question of their alumni, or they've attended an event, or they live in the community, or they've signed up for a newsletter, or they've requested more information about something, or just a whole variety of things. And when you represent that visually, it asks a whole bunch of questions, sometimes answers some of them, but leaves you with a sense of the kind of questions that you'd want to be able to answer. So if they came in expressing interest in some particular part of your organization, you might be able to test and see how likely is that person to be able to convert into a donor versus someone who maybe sent in an honor memorial gift for someone that they knew, but they didn't have a particular connection to the organization. And I think the more you think about sort of the inputs and the outputs and sort of what analysis you can get out of your system, that diagram is the kind of thing that helps you put it into context, as opposed to just looking at a list of, 10,000 constituents and 5,000 gifts and trying to make sense of it. When you start to create it graphically, it gives you a creativity and an insight that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And it can be a little bit of, it takes practice. It's something we've been doing for a long time, but we were certainly bad at it when we first started. But it's a different way. It's an easier way to actually communicate with your colleagues, because pictures always work better than words. And you can always hang words off of pictures if you need to. But starting with that visual approach, that journey or flow approach to it, is really, really helpful.
That's great insight. And I'm going to actually back up a step from where you guys are at with the visualization of the constituent journey and suggest that the question be asked, who are our constituents? One of the best and most insightful things that I've helped, that has been helpful to a lot of nonprofits, including as well as for-profits when I was in that arena, was helping clients do an audience analysis just to determine how their audience was broken down, and who they were and what relationships should be prioritized. That goes to inform brand strategy. It's informed communication strategy and development strategy as well. So knowing who your constituents are and really understanding them, even if it requires some sort of market analysis study or survey. When people hear those kinds of words, they often think expensive, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And again, that's where a SurveyMonkey account and a just good knowledge of best practices can be a big help for you, because if you have the right best practices, then you can implement those kinds of learning processes at a relatively low cost.
I just want to note that my microphone was stuck on mute, and that was exactly the point that I wanted to make as I listened to Peter Gross talk. I think embedded in my answer was a little bit of my bias towards thinking that an individual giving program is extremely important. I mean, I think I explicitly said that it was some of the most important constituents. But I need to get agreement across an organization that in fact is the case. And every organization is how they engage with and interact constituents, and can't treat them all equally. And at the intro of what you added, Peter Maris, that's what I took from that, is that the starting point before you get to journey is probably understanding how important is this constituent group or this audience, and how much am I willing to invest in that experience and in that journey, and how does it relate to the business objectives of the organization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, that helps indicate what is necessary as opposed to what's desirable, or helps take a lot of the guesswork out of what you need to do strategically and tactically. We didn't really touch on technology selection too much in answering this question, but the next question really speaks to that. And that is, what are the potential pitfalls in selecting a new CRM system for my organization? I think that this is a question that if it's not explicitly voiced, we see it in the eyes of our clients oftentimes, especially those that have been through failed CRM selections or implementations before. And it's especially, those pitfalls can be especially damaging now in the CRM as a platform era where, when you're selecting a CRM, it's, it's potentially integrating with or directly built in with things like learning management systems and human relation systems, and there are even entire accounting systems that are built on the Salesforce platform, among other platforms. So, Peter G., what would you say are the potential pitfalls in selecting a new CRM system?
Yeah, I have a couple that I would point out. The first one is the assumption going in that the selection process, should start by looking at the capabilities of the other CRM systems that are out there. And it's an easy thing to do because when you're frustrated with your current system, it's very comforting to go out and look at systems that appear to be easier to use, more functionally robust, have cleaner data, largely because it's sample data, but nevertheless, they have cleaner data in them, and so it all feels much more comforting. But I would say the single biggest challenge that I've seen in folks actually adopting new CRM systems, which in our view starts at the selection process, is really an inability on the part of the organization to gain agreement about how it wants to do its business. And I would go back to this individual giving question and some stuff that Kyle said. If your individual giving program and how you're analyzing it and executing it is going to rely on pulling information and constituents from a lot of different departments, those things are frequently brought down and not successful because of a failure to gain agreement across the organization. Now, that has very little to do with technology. That has to do with the organization. But being clear on what the expectations are for how your business is going to run is the most important thing you can do in advance or in the beginning of starting a selection process. Because if there's clear articulation and agreement on first, how we run our business, second, how that turns into processes and requirements and data requirements that can be communicated to vendors in order to be tested and see what solutions are working, everything else becomes easier from there. In almost all cases, selections that lead to implementations that go badly because of business reasons, not because of technology reasons. The second pitfall we see is a tendency to isolate the selection of the CRM in a particular department, and that's often fundraising, although we have certainly seen sometimes, or fundraising or development, we've certainly seen times where the organization has sort of handed that off to the IT or IS department to sort of run with it because it's a piece of technology. But the truth is that even in an organization that is sort of heavily fundraising centric, a CRM or a fundraising system is an enterprise system, and that it affects program areas, it affects finance, obviously it affects IS or IT, the executive suite, as well as external constituents, sometimes to greater or lesser degrees. And those stakeholders that are heavily affected by the selection should be in the selection process from the beginning. Now, sometimes some of them might be more heavily involved and some of them might be more in a consultative role occasionally. But what we like to say is that the implementation begins with the selection, and we want to model the behavior that we're expecting to engender in this CRM system in the selection process as we're beginning it. And involvement is the only way to make that happen.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that a really avoidable pitfall is just to include the individuals that perform or manage the business processes that you're looking for the new system to improve. Otherwise, you'll end up with a solution that doesn't meet your needs and you have unhappy staff. I would also, make it a priority to give staff that are involved in the selection sort of the time and resources to be thoughtfully involved by providing temps or potentially delaying other organizational priorities so that this is considered the most important and not just a side project that people have to fit into their already busy days.
Kyle, did you have something to add to this?
Are you on mute and saying wonderful things on mute, Kyle?
No.
I was actually thinking about what Joe had just said. And I think you said it as well, Peter. One of the biggest pitfalls is this feeling of lurching, and software selections, when they're done well, they take a ton of time and energy, and implementations are no different, and implementations are hard. And I would want to be sure that if sort of this idea of CRM wasn't working for my organization, and when I talk about CRM, I'm talking about more than just the technology. If it's not working for my organization, I would want to make darn sure that technology really was to blame, because this feeling of lurching, we've seen it. It saps energy and saps morale, and people should, especially executives, should be attendant to the amount of energy that this work takes on top of what the work that we all normally have to do in our lives at nonprofits.
Yeah, and this is Peter Gross. I would just expand on that, Kyle, because I think that's absolutely right. And I probably would reorder mine to say that the first pitfall is assuming that the problem is the technology. And it might be, but the solution almost certainly starts outside of the technology and leads later to whatever the right technology might be.
Yep. This is Peter Muris again. I would just say also, in addition to what my colleagues have said, that for all of the presentations that we make about data management or data quality, particularly as having to do with CRM, the questions about how to make sure those things happen well always comes back to leadership. And I don't want to get it, the idea of leadership and technology change is one that we could go on forever, and we've done a past webinar on change management, and that's a factor in it. So if you want to go to the resources section of the Build Consulting website at buildconsulting.com, you'll see that. But I did also want to call attention to those who are interested in the idea of leadership and technology change efforts that the top article on our blog right now, the most recently published that is called The Top 5 Ways Nonprofit Leadership Should Support Technology Change Efforts. It was written by our colleague David Deal based on his considerable experience in this area. And it uses CRM, example of a successful CRM system and implementation and a failed implementation as being the example for that. And there's a lot of great information in there for leaders that leaders can take advantage of, and that we certainly can help bring to the attention of nonprofit leadership where others inside of the organization might not feel they have the voice to make those points. I want to go ahead and move on to the next question, and it is a doozy. Our CRM seemed perfect during the sales pitch, but in reality, there are a lot of workarounds that are taking up a lot of my time. Striking out the curse words that might be included after that statement. Is this common? That's a great question, and one that we get a lot. Let's see. I think I'm going to go to Peter G on this one. Why don't you kick us off, Peter?
Sure. So the short answer is it's unbelievably common. I would say a fair number of the projects that we've been involved in have involved some sort of expectation of the perfection of the system that is coming in. And part of that is that sales engineers or solution engineers or demo folks are just really good at demoing their software, partially because they're really good at it, and partially because they structure it in such a way that you're not seeing all the sausage being made when you're going through that exercise. And I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is, we try to structure, when we run selections with our clients, we try to structure our demos in a way that is specific enough in what we're asking the vendors to do, so that we get to see a little bit of an example of what a day in the life looks like for a particular process for a particular staff member. That's not going to 100% solve the problem, but if you just allow the vendors to show what they want, they're going to show you all the candy and they're not going to show you the vegetables. The second one is more of just a general perspective about selecting CRMs, that you should always expect that when you get a piece of software, no matter how you feel about it, it's going to be some combination of, it should do a fair amount out of the box. Maybe that number is 60 to 70%. There's going to be some of the remaining percentage that's going to require you to do that process differently, unless you really want to have a workaround. And then the rest of it may either be, maybe there's a little bit of a clunky workaround in there, or there's a customization if you can make the business justification for the cost associated with it. And there is sometimes that case to be made. And some, those percentages are just guidelines. As Joe will tell you, having been through an implementation where it was more like 60% custom in terms of the expense of the project, they do vary. But I think you should always go into an implementation, particularly of a CRM, expecting we're not going to be able to do exactly the way we do business now. It's going to have to be adjusted in one way or another.
Yeah, I think that I'm reading this question as in it's already been implemented and we're sort of stuck now with this solution. So getting over the grievances, I would probably, think about, before working out that time-consuming workaround, that this might be a great opportunity to review the business process itself. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a staff person and, we're assessing sort of the business process, and I say, why are you doing it this way? And they come back and say, I don't know, this is how I was taught to do it. And so, perhaps workflows have been made overly complicated over time, and not because of a strategic business need. So I would always question why the organization needs it to be this way. And then if there's sufficient reasoning, obviously you need to work around the limitations of the software. But I would also, as far as solutions, I would look to some of the apps I mentioned earlier that could potentially integrate with the system that was chosen, versus manually doing the timely workaround.
I mean, I think the lousy thing about going third is that Peter and Joe always steal all of the good answers, and I have to really work to find something that's additive.
You don't have to come up with anything if you don't want to.
Well, maybe the one thing I would add is going back to this. I think both Joe and Peter said this, that if there's a perfect system that doesn't have any workarounds, I haven't seen it, and I would love for somebody on today's call, if they've seen it, to let me know what it is. And it's really about doing the software selection process well. And Peter Gross talked about some of the things that comprise that. Going back to what I think one of the first questions where I was talking about, this idea of platform as a service and an organization-wide CRM system, if that's the vision, it means that there are going to have to be workarounds. There is just not enough money in the world that is going to build a CRM system that requires no flexibility in how departments and people work. So I think Peter and Joe offered some specific examples about how to get at those instances, how to address them. But I think it's really about setting the stage at the beginning with the organization, with your organization, saying, we need to do the selection well. We need to get the percentage as high as we possibly can around what this solution does for us natively and matches how we work. But we also have to be willing to change how we work and to answer the question, why are we doing something differently? And how important is it to mesh up the software to what it is that we're doing, especially when you're talking about fundraising specifically.
Mm-hmm. I just want to close the book on this question by offering some advice to the audience, and that is, there might be some room for hope within your current system. I mean, not everything is learned during the sales process or even in the initial training. I mean, I once had a client that was doing something really complex, manual reporting outside of the system, data export first and then manipulation, that was taking a good 8 to 12 hours a month. And in reality, it was literally just 2 clicks that they weren't aware of inside of the system that would have produced the exact same report in less than 2 minutes. So it's always good to go back and take a look at, get a refresher. A lot of organizations skimp on training, and as a result, their system admins and other staff have very low awareness of everything that their systems can do. So there's room for hope for improvements within the context of the existing systems often. Can just be sometimes a matter of becoming more familiar with the platform. We only have a couple of minutes to tackle the next question, which is good because we kind of anticipated it earlier. And that is, what's the role of leadership in supporting good constituent relationship management practices? We already touched on this, but I would invite Joe, if you have anything to add based on this experience. I know you've been through the wars with a couple different organizations where leadership was out of alignment. So,
yeah, well, I shouldn't say obviously, because sometimes it's not obvious, but leadership plays an integral role in any successful CRM adoption and management. And I think, like you said, we touched on it previously, and I think it was Peter G's comment that the database system itself may be maintained by the IT or development department, but the organization owns their institutional intelligence, which is usually their constituent data. So all leaders from CIO down to program managers, they should understand the importance of that great data management and sort of be cheerleaders, be vocal about the importance of CRM. Some things that we've instituted across organizations with build teams is, nonprofits should consider establishing sort of a CRM governance structure that's made up of staff from a variety of different levels and departments. And so even the optics of that, it's, seen as an organizational priority. One of the other things that I've suggested was to incorporate CRM entry use interaction into staff's annual goals to make sure that there is some sort of accountability. Because otherwise, if it's not part of their goals, sometimes it's just an additive, and it's not given the importance that it needs. But yes, successful adoption of any new protocol or system, indisputably starts from the top down.
Yeah, if we have time, Peter, I would just add a couple of things to build on that. I think there's 2 things that leaders in the organization have to do. One is they have to use the system themselves. I use this example a lot, but if my 89-year-old father can build a family tree online with thousands of entries, then there isn't a single executive in the world that has an excuse not to use a system to add and consume information. The second thing is, and I learned this early on in my career doing an implementation at a university in New Orleans, was if you're holding meetings, I'll just use it as an example because that's what the example at the university. When they held major gift meetings, they didn't allow information to be analyzed. In other words, the reports to get created and handed out that didn't come out of, in that case, the Razor's Edge. If it wasn't in the Razor's Edge in that particular example, it simply didn't exist. And you'd be amazed at how quickly that sets the example of having high volumes of and high quality data in the system. Because no one was allowed to bring their own Excel spreadsheet to it saying, look how much work I did. If you didn't do it in Razor's Edge, it didn't exist. That's what I would add.
Kyle, you want to tack something on it real quick at the end here?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have leadership on board, you should either pump or stomp on the brakes as hard as possible, especially if you're talking about making additional investments in CRM. And effective leaders understand that CRM is more than just a piece of technology, as I think we've hit on multiple times. And maybe if you don't hit the brakes, maybe you should even take the keys out of the ignition and throw them out the window into a lake. You just absolutely have to have leaders involved in communicating and supporting the importance of CRM.
Great. Yeah, we've seen many a project scuttled by inconsistent or lack of leadership being involved in these kinds of projects in all the ways mentioned. And as I mentioned earlier, if you go to buildconsulting.com/blog, you'll see the article that I referenced. It'll help you to understand more all of the aspects of that. So in closing today, and this is a good segue into this slide, if you'd like more information on this topic and other related topics, you can visit our blog or our learning resources section of our site, and you could subscribe for our newsletter by going to buildconsulting.com/newsletter. We generally send things out once or twice a month, so we're not going to send you a lot of stuff, but it's going to be high value. And then again, if you have any questions that didn't get answered today, or you didn't want to send in using the GoToWebinar thing, or we didn't hit everything that met your expectations, let us know. We'd love to chat with you. You can reach out to us on Twitter or LinkedIn. You can also just send us an email directly through the website at buildconsulting.com/contact. And before we close, just a quick pitch for next month's Community IT webinar in June. There's going to be an announcement going out about that soon. I'm not sure what the exact date is, but it's Encryption 101. And the idea of this webinar is that encryption is rapidly becoming the preferred method for securing information. So Community IT is going to talk about the basics of encryption, how it's currently used in popular systems such as website and email, and simple tools for using encryption to secure devices and information. So it's something, especially with new compliance regulations coming out later this month, is getting a lot of attention right now. Understanding exactly what encryption is, how it works, and what its vulnerabilities are, if not complemented by other security mechanisms, are very important. And with that, we're at time. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope this was valuable use of your time, and we look forward to meeting with you again in the future. Take care.